Many of you are probably already familiar with the concept of refresh rate and frame rates. Those metrics reflect your experience of a game. To put things simply, having a high frame rate in-game will give you a smoother visual experience when viewed on a high refresh rate display than when you've got a lower frame rate or are using a lower refresh rate display. But there's another whole part to this picture. That's latency. And that's something that doesn't just affect your experience, but might also actually give you a competitive edge. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll find out what NVIDIA's done with their Reflex technologies to lower latency and make you a more competitive gamer. Now to start, we have to first know what latency means. There are two kinds of latency: network latency and system latency. Network latency is also known commonly as ping, and we can't do much about that because that's the delay between your computer sending a game signal and the game server receiving that signal, so we won't go into that. On the other hand, system latency has become something that we, as end users, are able to control, so let's dive into that a little bit. This is the delay between you making an action on an input device and the resulting action appearing on the screen. A common example of this is seen in games like Valorant. The latency here is the delay between you clicking your mouse and the actual muzzle flash from your gun appearing on the screen. Now, system latency can be further broken down into three broad sections. First, there's input latency between your input device and the PC. Then, there's the latency within your PC itself as your components work to process an action. And finally, there's latency between the display signal being sent out of your PC and the monitor actually displaying the visual result. Now, we'll focus on the latency that's happening within your PC. Typically, when an instruction comes in from an input device, the first component that processes this instruction is your CPU. It computes what action your input should trigger, performs physics computations, decides on NPC actions and reactions, or works out any environmental changes that occur, things like that. Your CPU then has to hand the result of these computations to your GPU, because the result of your action has to be rendered and output to a display, and that's what your GPU does. More often than not, your CPU sends instructions to your GPU faster than the GPU can actually process them, and the CPU therefore has to add these instructions into a render queue. But this increases your latency as your frames have to wait in line to be rendered. In other words, when you press a mouse button, the resulting action doesn't get sent to your monitor immediately, because this manner of processing information means the frame that contains the result of your actions gets queued up. So one way to lower this latency is to reduce the render queue, so your instructions are passed from the CPU to the GPU and rendered as soon as possible. To do this, NVIDIA has implemented two new features, one on the driver level and one on the game level. At the driver level, you can open the NVIDIA control panel to turn your low latency mode to ultra. At the game level, NVIDIA has released its Reflex software development kit, or SDK, to game developers, so you can turn on NVIDIA Reflex low latency natively in-game. Now when switched on, both of these reduce the render queue, but the in-game NVIDIA Reflex option will be more effective and operates independently of the driver-based ultra low latency mode. If both are enabled, NVIDIA Reflex will override the ultra low latency mode. Now, it's worth noting that NVIDIA Reflex comes with three options: off, on, and on plus boost. Now, off and on are pretty straightforward, but on plus boost basically overrides the power saving features on your GPU, allowing it to remain at a high clock speed even when CPU bound. Basically, this keeps the GPU ready to receive and render frames as quickly as possible, which is useful especially if your CPU submits a large batch of instructions to the GPU for rendering all of a sudden. Now, enabling on plus boost is the same as going into the NVIDIA control panel and setting your power management settings to prefer maximum performance. Let's see Reflex in action. Here we have our new Dreamcore Alpha, decked out with an Intel Core i7-10700KF, an MSI RTX 3070 Gaming X Trio, 16GB of Corsair Vengeance RGB Pro memory clocked at 3600MHz on an MSI Z490A Pro. Oh, by the way, did you know? Some of our PCs ship on the same day that they're ordered. Just head to www.dreamcore.com.sg, check out one of our dream builds, and you can be up and ready to game within 24 hours. You'll find this exact set of specifications in our Dreadnought Tier 2 Intel Dream build. Now, the proper way to measure system latency would involve using NVIDIA's Reflex Latency Analyzer, which requires a compatible mouse and display. But, like most of you guys, we don't have those awesome 360Hz G-Sync displays here. Unfortunately, we're quite poor. Fortunately, Reflex supported games like Apex Legends, Valorant, Fortnite, and Call of Duty now come with built-in game performance metrics that we can rely on to get a rough idea of our system's latency. This measurement won't be the end-to-end full latency that you feel, but it'll be a good way for all of you at home to get started on your latency optimization journey. We'll show you how to get this set up on Fortnite, but the settings are quite similar for the other games as well. Under Fortnite's menu, just select Turn on Latency Markers. Next, go under the third tab and turn on Latency Debug Stats. That's all you need to show the relevant stats. Now, remember, these are latency numbers typically measured in milliseconds, so the lower the better. To improve these numbers, simply go back to the menu and turn on the NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency. You'll want to turn it on to either on or on plus boost to get the low latency benefit. What you expect to see is anywhere between a 30 to 50% reduction in latency, depending on the game that you're playing, your in-game settings, as well as the resolution that you're playing at. Of course, for games that are less GPU bound, like Valorant, you might not see much improvement because there's no render queue if your GPU is waiting for instructions from your CPU. But the fact is that this feature comes included with all modern NVIDIA graphics cards from the 900 series onwards, so you should definitely go and turn it on for that latency reduction if you can. Now, you may think this is not important, or that it doesn't really matter because you can't feel it, but the true difference here is not whether you can feel it, but whether there is a difference in the latency between your system and your opponent's system. Think about it. If your opponent's PC has a lower latency than yours, then he'll be able to see you before you can see him, and that puts you at a disadvantage. And this has nothing to do with your skills. This is just your PC being slow in showing the actual event that's happening. So what can you do? First, use the game and render latencies provided by the in-game Reflex SDK to figure out what's wrong. If your game latency is high, consider picking up a faster CPU. But if your render latency is high, consider picking up a faster GPU, like this RTX 3070 we saw in our alpha earlier on. The benefit of getting a better GPU is also that you get significantly higher FPS or frame rate. While a better CPU will help in some gaming scenarios where your performance is CPU bound, your frame rate is more dependent on your GPU than your CPU most of the time. So a better GPU will almost always result in a better use of your cache. NVIDIA's new Reflex technology is available on NVIDIA's new 30 series graphics cards, but it's also available from the 900 series onwards. That means if you've got an older GTX 970, all you need is an updated driver and a compatible game to enjoy these new features. So now you know, both FPS and latency work hand in hand to get you the performance you need to stay competitive. So focus on chasing that high frame rate, but don't forget to keep your latency low. Thanks to NVIDIA for supporting us, and we hope you learned something in this video. If you did, don't forget to leave a comment, like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for notifications, and maybe we'll consider making more videos like this one in future. Until the next one, stay frosty guys.